All right, we're going to now start on the second part of this chapter, heteropatriarchy and environmental domination. Okay? And I want you to think about the films again because there's Gods of Our Fathers, The Origins of Patriarchy, and the Marilyn Waring film I put up, Who's Counting. Both relate to this very much so. So the ideas about bodies and social ecology are conditioned by relations of gender and sexuality. And that shapes how our bodies are interpreted and controlled. And the word controlled is very important, talking about heteropatriarchy here. The Handmaid's Tale was recently remade into a TV series. It's a wonderful film, which I wish people would watch more. And then, of course, the book is certainly worth reading. If you're familiar with that story, you'll understand where the term uh, shaping how our bodies are interpreted and controlled. Also, think about the abortion rights issues that are happening right now. Think about trans kids stuff that's happening right now as well, book banning, all of that. Bodies controlled and interpreted. It can be very hard to have this dialogue. And some of you may be, resisting right now. And I'm sorry if that's the case, but we got to do it. So, and you'll see how this fits in with the environment as we move along. The reason it's hard so often to have this dialogue is because the words like feminism and patriarchy and queer mean different things to different people. And they can really bring up very strong feelings. So we're going to start with definitions. I'm not doing the long definitions that are in the book that I'm sure you've read. They're longer and with examples, but let's just quickly go over some definitions. Sexism is discrimination based on sex or gender. Feminism is a movement to end sexism and the sexist exploitation and oppression of women. That's from Bell Hooks, her quote. It's not anti men. Okay. Queer refers to the diversity of normative sexualities and gender. And patriarchy, which literally from the Latin and Greek means rule of the father. Patri, father, as in paternal, is a root word for that. And archy means who has the political power, who has control. Think of the suffix archy with monarchy. Okay, same suffix, archy. That means rule of one. Whatever the prefix is who the has the control or the rule. If you think of anarchy, an means not against, nothing. There's nobody in control theoretically with anarchy. Oligarchy, rule of a few. The archies are democracy. You have to change the spelling of archy for it to be correct. Demos is people in Greek, so it's the rule of the people. So patriarchy, when you hear that, is literally rule of the father, but it's basically male rule. Heteropatriarchy is a social organization in which patriarchal power interlocks with power advantages for heterosexuality. Okay. And it's so normalized that it's often difficult to recognize. Until people who aren't heterosexual males get into positions of power, we don't really pay attention to the fact that they're 99% heterosexual males, right? There's patriarchy, but it's heterosexual males. So the big brouhaha about Pete Buttigieg being, a powerful person in politics because he's gay is one of the examples, or queer. So one of the most important aspects of sociology, as we've said over and over and over, peel the onion, well, another term is to point out what's hidden in plain sight and documenting the impacts of what's hidden in plain sight, like a heteropatriarchal order, and that includes inequality and environmental inequality. So we're going to find out now what this has to do with the environment and with ecology by looking at the ecology of sexism. So it's very common in Western ideology that women are closer to nature than men. And so not only is nature thought of as being female, think of Mother Nature, but women are thought of as being more natural than men, whereas men are more intellectual, right, in their heads. They've got brains, we've got bodies. Women associated with nature are associated with nature in giving birth, raising children, preparing food, healing the sick, cleaning, attending to emotional ties, which mostly women needs, and the private reproductive sphere, i.e., sex. So those are ways in which women are thought to be much more affiliated with nature. So what happens is those gendered associations represent an obvious hierarchy with men at the top. And it's moralized by portraying women as not as capable of abstract thought that distinguishes the human species. So if you're more natural, then you're more like an animal, because animals don't have the kind of intellectual thought that human males do, right? Here's Edmund Burke, the famous 18th century philosopher, who said, "Woman is but an animal, and an animal not of the highest order." And Hegel, the German philosopher, said, "Women are certainly capable of learning, but they are not made for the higher forms of science." And, you know, if you think about this, one of the great prescriptions for women in the late 19th, earliest 20th century, for instance, if they were getting uppity or acting out in some way or depressed or anxious, was that they not read. You had a rest cure. They were often institutionalized. No books, nothing that stimulated the brain, because poor women, when their brains got stimulated, they got kind of crazy. Another cure was hysterectomies for women who were feeling those feelings that I just described. So think about, once again, control of women's bodies and the fact that, you know, too much thought or brain work, you know, can be upsetting to women. Today, most would agree that the social implications of that kind of patriarchal thought and those statements of those philosophers, Burke and Hegel, are very troubling. But not everybody, I added in there to myself, would think that they were troubling. Okay. Now, let's look at some social facts, because many people would say, well, what domination of women? We're in this, you know, modern age now, and those things aren't true anymore. Okay. And so if you take a general social class, depending on if it's the first term or the second term or social problems, you will delve deeply into the issues of gender and what's going on with it. But here's some factoids for you that are in this text. As of 2018, in the United States, women earn 18% less than men, partially because they're more likely to have lower wage jobs, but they tend to receive even less when they have equivalent jobs as men, the same jobs as men. So the percentage of the discrepancy of how much less they're paid goes up when they have, you know, when they're both account executives or something of that nature. In 2017 in Germany and the UK, the gap's even wider between men and women. It's 21%. And of course, as we know, many jobs are very highly gender segregated. And here's another kicker, so that women are funneled into lower paying jobs. But when men enter traditional women's jobs, guess what? Instead of hitting a glass ceiling where they can't increase their income, they hit what's called a glass escalator. And I know this is true from talking to, I teach a lot of nursing students, and this is true. When men entered the nursing profession and were recruited for the nursing profession, because historically that was a female occupation, right? Men were doctors and women were nurses. But as men entered that profession, they came in at higher salaries. Um, Also, if you think about the gendered language, previously that's changed a lot, but uh, think about waitresses versus servers. Now we call people servers. Think about um, stewardesses versus flight attendants. So the language has changed. Unfortunately, the salaries haven't necessarily. So here's another thing. 42% of women in the United States have experienced job related gender discrimination. Even worse, of course, it's exacerbated by racial discrimination. So 8% of white women compared to 22% of black women in the United States report having been passed over for important positions due to gender. This one is one that really gets me because we would live in a different world if this were not true. Women hold only 1 in 4 political positions in the United States at local, state, and national level. We are 52% of the population. We're slightly over half of the population in the United States. And we are only hold 1 in 4 political positions. Now that's getting better. And we have a first woman vice president, but there's a long way to go with that. Okay. Women still do by far the bulk of the work at home. That has improved as well in certain situations, certain social classes where men are helping more. Men are contributing more at home, but still women do the bulk in general. 1 in 3 women in the United States have experienced sexual violence. 1 in 5 attempted or completed rape. And worldwide, more women live in poverty than men. And between the ages of 25 and 34, their poverty rates are 22% higher than men. Now, if you think about that, that's the childbearing years, right? And there's nothing that throws you into poverty faster, even in an industrialized nation, or at least this industrialized nation, than being a single parent. I believe the last time I looked at the statistics, it was 50%, only 50% of men who are mandated to pay child support do so. So that even with child support, it can be a very tough road to be a single parent, but without it, it's extremely difficult. So what does this have to do with the environment? Well, the domination of women, as you'll see, has significant environmental implications. For one thing, remember we talked about the goods and the bads, I think, in the first chapter. Women are less likely to receive a share of the environmental goods due to less income. They can't afford them, and which makes them more susceptible to environmental bads. And that is true, and especially in communities of color. The second shift is another way that this in fact affects women. That's the name of the title of a book written by a woman sociologist named Arlie Hochschild. And what she's referring to is the unpaid work that women do. And also the film with Marilyn Waring that I put up, Who's Counting, which was, the original title was Sex, Lies, and the Global Economy, but it's Who's Counting now. It's a fascinating, fascinating story. But that is what she addresses as well, is the unpaid work that women do all over the world. The huge contribution they make economically, but receive none of the benefits of that in terms of actual money. So patriarchal ideas are baked into how we feel about ourselves as individuals, and how we participate in the economy as consumers as well, because we talked about this before. We purchase goods that communicate who we are to the world, which is part of our socialization. We're going to look at gender socialization later on here. So gendered ideas and socialization not only affects how we participate in the economy, but who actually engages in environmental activism. women participate in environmental actionism to a much greater degree than men do. And there's several reasons for that. But because patriarchal ideas so strongly limit what men can actually do, as Bell Hooks says, it's, quote, a system that denies men full access to their freedom of will. And this is something that is, I think, so important to understand. And we used to talk about it when I taught women's studies in class. It was mostly women in class, but there was always a couple of men. And it was really interesting to have this discussion because there's this assumption that patriarchy only affects women. It's the oppression of women, but it oppresses men too, in the limits it puts on men, on one hand, of who and what they can be, if it isn't a stereotypical male, whatever the society calls male or idealizes as male, and their expression of themselves. So, and what's okay and what's not okay for them is just as powerful as it is for women in this patriarchal system. For one, here's some examples. It encourages men to take really foolish environmental risks with machines, for example. If you think about young male drivers, why are the insurance rates so high until you hit, I don't know what the age is, 28 or 27? Because they have so many accidents, because they're taking risks that when they get older, they don't take as much, okay? So they take risks with machines, they take risks with chemicals, with weather, with land, with all of that. Men often die, are maimed, or become diseased as a result of some of those things that they do. And it's one of the reasons that men generally do not live as long as women. They are involved in more dangerous and toxic situations. Okay? Coal mining is just a tragic example of that. The coal industry makes cultural ties between coal and masculinity. And what that does is it deters men, obviously, from engaging in local environmental justice movements. At the same time, this gendered framing of injustice can leave men without a sense of belonging in protest politics, right? It's not, they're going to go the other direction if all these women are involved in protest politics. And, they have this strong silent role, whereas women can, derive connections from these ecological issues. Motherhood, for example. If you're a mother, and you would think if you were a father, but we know from the amount of women involved in these issues, motherhood can really spur you to get very involved in environmental issues. I know in the third film of The Goddess Remembered, which you can, I put the titles down for you. Look them up on YouTube if you want to see them. Are all these amazing women authors and activists, that they interview and talk to. And one of them, her daughter came home from school one day saying, "Mom, we learned about all these, awful thing that's happening with the environment." And this film was made 15 or more years ago. And the mother's listening and commiserating and all that. And the young daughter, it's a grammar school age kid, says, "Well, do something, do something about it." And so that's one of the reasons that women are tend to be more involved in these movements, is because of the children that they birthed and cared about, and, all of that. And men ideally do too. But so much of those kinds of connections and deep, deep, deep feelings have been socialized out of them through the patriarchy. So, what is ecofeminism? Ecofeminism are the links between the domination of women and the environment. So, once again, if you want to see what it was like before those links got broken, that film that I put up, The Goddess Remembered, will go there. Ecofeminists argue that the exploitation of women and the environment originates with social domination of all kinds. So it's race, ethnicity, class, age, not just gender. It's very common for socially dominated groups to be linked with nature, if you think about this. White people, like those colonists we talked about last week, have long associated people of color with savagery. They're primitive, they're like animals, etc. That was certainly said about the Africans that were rounded up and brought over here, in shackles as slaves in America. There's a lot of writing by whites about how primitive and animal-like they were. The wealthy often see poor people, not just Black people or people of color, but poor people, as having little control over their emotions, and which leads to a greater tendency towards violence and sexual licentiousness. So ideas around femininity and especially motherhood can be a strong force when it involves confronting environmental injustices. It can really unite those on the margins to action, as I just said, when your children are starving, or when you're like in Flint, when the water's completely polluted that everybody has to drink, including your kids, etc. When your children are getting lead poisoning, that's a huge motivation to action. But there's another side to gendering. There's a downside to gendering the environment as well, and that whole Mother Earth concept, and that popular slogan, "Love your mother." I love that slogan. However, it can be used, as we talked about, with selling products as being ecological or environmentally okay in some way. So they can be used to create an ideology to soften the blow, kind of. So Exxon, for instance, used the image of Mother Earth to minimize the disaster of the Exxon Valdez spill by saying things like having ads that say, "Mother Nature cleans up and does quite a cleaning job." Now, do you see the affiliation with women cleaning and how? Okay. Another one, National Geographic says about the oil spill, "Mother Nature has rolled up her sleeves." Well, the implication here is that, don't worry, Mom's going to take care of it. Mom will pick up after us like she does at home. And so that vision of the environment, using the language of Mother Earth, which I feel truly is accurate, but using it in that way is both, that vision of the environment is both ecologically problematic and sexist as well. So don't worry, the laundry and dishes will get done invisibly. You don't have to think about it, in other words. So are women nicer to the environment? Well, maybe yes, maybe that's true, as it turns out. Although we're going to refine that in a moment here. So the data says that women actually commit fewer environmental crimes. In 1,100 federally prosecuted environmental crime cases between 1985 and 2006, men committed 87% and women only 5%. And the gender identity of the 9% is not known. And those violations included violations of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and also some illegal imports. Why? Are men inherently opposed to the environment? No, they're not, as it turns out. The key here is that they're simply in more powerful positions of control and decision making. Therefore, the numbers of environmental crimes that occur happen to be perpetrated by males as head of corporations or heads of businesses or a variety of other things. So when, it doesn't mean that women are perfect by any means at all. And until women get into those positions, well, then we could make an accurate comparison, right? How many women as opposed to how many men commit environmental crimes. But right now, the vast majority of people in positions to commit environmental crimes are males, because that's about power. What's the controversy over ecofeminism? Well, many of the insights of ecofeminism, and once again, The Goddess Remembered, and if you watch the whole series, those are all ecofeminists, and particularly the last one, Return of the Goddess, or Full Circle, I can't remember which the name of it is, that I put up how to get to it on in the class, is all these women that are ecofeminists and brilliant writers and things. But there's been a criticism, particularly in academia, around ecofeminism because social scientists generally are not into spirituality. And so there was a very strong emphasis on spirituality in interdisciplinary ecofeminism in the beginning. So critics saw what the social scientist critics saw as a problem with that is what's called essentialism. And that is that in this situation, that essentialism was characterizing women's relationship to nature as somehow gendered, in that it was inherent that women were more connected to nature. And so we're right back to those old ideas of women being more natural, right? So what's the ecology of heterosexism? Okay. Well, the ideology and of heterosexism is that it's not LGBTQ, folks. It's not natural. Bestiality, social collapse. Those were all terms that Mike Pence used. Okay. As of 2019, a dozen states have some version of anti-LGBTQ laws. I had to add that, of course, there are more now in the last year or two. And every day we hear about a new law that's anti-LGBTQ in some form or manner. So the idea of naturalization, as it's called, is central to the idea of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity. Hetero is, remember, different of two, and normativity refers to normal. So the definition of heteronormativity is the ideology of gender as binary, just two, right? Heterosexuality and monogamy as normal, and other gender and sexual identities as abnormal. Now, we need to go back to the monogamy in there. The second part of the definition is heterosexuality and monogamy as normal. Do you know that there are more cultures that are polygamous than monogamous in the world? Not numbers of people. Often they're very small cultures. Not always, because in many Muslim countries there's polygamy. But there are actually more cultures that practice polygamy than monogamy. So obviously, monogamy is not, quote, natural. It's one way to organize a society and sexual reproduction and power arrangements, right? So prejudice and or discrimination from heteronormative ideas is called heterosexism, and that's what we're looking at here. And then that is a form of sexual domination. And that's what we're seeing all over the country right now with these anti-LGBTQ laws. You make an assumption of a normative way of being, and you impose that on everybody else, right? So heterosexism is hetero, the other of two, And sexism, you know already. Homophobia is this irrational fear, phobia, uh, from the group of people who are different in that way, LGBTQ. Okay. Um, and your book asks this question, aren't we basically over this? And the book was published in 2019. They should know better. No, we're not over it. Yes, we have gay marriage laws and that type of thing. I mean, you know, gay marriage is legal and all of that. But we are seeing such a huge backlash. And so it looks like we might have thought we were over it, but we're far from over it. So there are just terrible statistics about suicide and depression and incarceration. This is where the trans kids stuff is such a sad situation right now. There are countries where you can be imprisoned or put to death for being LGBTQ. But the key point here is, and why are we even investigating it in this subject about the environment? The key point is that the oppression of LGBTQ people is environmental. And if you look at food insecurity rates, for instance, 2014, 17% of heterosexual households didn't have enough money to buy food during the previous year. This is in the United States. And LGBTQ folks, it was 27%, so 10% higher. And heterosexism and racism, when you add that in, food insecurity rises to 42% for African American LGBTQ people. So, and this is another key point, like I was talking about with the patriarchy hurting men. Heteropatriarchy also hurts heterosexual people. If you think what poor boys have to go through growing up, I have a son. I remember, and he's heterosexual. Man, the cruelty on schoolyards and the names thrown around at people, you know, the jokes, fag, gay, you know, words that have the effect of really limiting the types of things that heterosexual men can do. Art, not sports, for example, right? What about male ballet dancers? There's a wonderful film called Billy Elliot that's British about a young boy in a working class coal mining family in England that wants to be a ballet dancer. Oh my goodness, it's so sad to see that whole story unfold. You should check it out. Billy Elliot's the name of the film. So those ideas hurt straight men as well, right? Because once again, you know, your pathway is just squinched down and narrowed to these very, very limiting ideas about what it is to be male. So queer ecology, the definition of that is a part of understanding our ideas about nature and sexuality. That's one aspect of it. And so queer theory helps us to understand that gender and sexuality are not necessarily natural and don't necessarily conform to heteronormative presumptions, which is a very important thing to understand about human sexuality. And there's a really important distinction here between sex, gender, and gender expression. Okay. I wish we were in a classroom because I used to love to teach this in a classroom. So sex is biological, XY, XX chromosomes, right? But gender is cultural. What it means to be male or female is a very cultural thing. The expectations of being a male or a female are culturally derived. And then gender expression is a different thing again. It's how we present ourselves, okay? In the Native American culture, you could look this up as well. I just couldn't put up such a huge number of things for you this week on video, but it's Two Spirits. It's an ancient um, understanding that there are people that are differently gendered and that manifest both male and female energies, and they're highly regarded. They often become medicine people and healers. The Europeans called it berdache, Berdache. It derives from a French word, but it's two spirits. And there's photos of two spirits also online that you can look up, and Native peoples talking about that. But those people, think about this, were honored. They were considered blessed. They were special. They had special gifts, right? Because they could channel and manifest both male and female energies. In Afghanistan, there's this tradition where women can become men when they're older so they can rule a clan if there's no man available to do that. And they do all the things that men do in terms of power and authority and law and that type of thing. But, you know, and they're dressed as men, but addressed as men. So none of this is new. Go back to the ancient Greeks, okay? So in other words, core aspects of human gender and sexuality are not simply given from nature, but they're socially constructed from the moment we're born and before we're born. And the reason I added before we're born is because why do people want to know the sex of the baby? You know, when I had my babies, you couldn't know that. That technology was not there. And that was one of the most fun things about having a baby was finding out what sex it was. And when you ask people today why they want to know, well, the main reason they want to know, what do you think it is? They want to know what to do with the nursery, right? What colors to paint it. People want to know for showers, what colors of clothes. You see how early it begins? Okay. Now there's gender reveal parties. I mean, it's like, anyway, I think I'm too old for all of this stuff, but it just seems nuts to me. It really, really does. I'm sure that there are really important reasons to know for some people what the gender of their child is, but it's just like opening your Christmas presents before Christmas morning to me. Um, and I mean, how early do you need to mold this kid into being either male or female, right? I mean, you see little tiny girl babies with bows taped to their bald little heads so that no one, God forbid, would mistake them for a male, or even more intensely, not know, right? That ambiguity really bothers people terribly. So it's just, it's such an interesting thing how early we begin with this. And, I often have told students in class, watch, if you're ever lucky enough to be like a sociologist in a store that has toy aisles, and there's a family with, I saw this once, that's why I always say this, with a little boy, and the little boy, I'm talking about a little boy, maybe 3 max, runs down the girls' toy aisle. And I saw the father almost, dislocate the kid's arm, yanking him back. Nope, hurt him down the boys' toy aisle. Well, now let's think about this. Like, let's use some critical thinking about this. Little kids are like crows. They love sparkly, interesting things visually, right? So just this you can do whether there's a little boy or a little girl or anybody else there. Stand at the end of a girl's toy aisle. See, they're already identified for you, right? As when you're tiny, and look down, and what do you see? You see bright colors, sparkly things often, uh, dolls with, particularly if they're not Barbies, if they're baby dolls with nice faces, friendly faces, Now go stand and look down the boys' toy aisle. What do you see? You see khaki, camouflage, toy hand grenades, GI Joes, which are not friendly looking at all. Well, if you're just a kid, and what's more interesting? You know, what's more appealing? What's more attractive? You have to be taught. You have to be carefully taught, as the song goes. And so that's what gender expression is. And then once we get that under our belt, then and can you see? And I'm sure some of you know this personally, how painful it is to have to find a different path, a different way, because it doesn't fit with you. So the difference that ideology makes, to sum all of this up, is that the theories that address the environmental significance of religion, individualism, and heteropatriarchy all have a very common theme. And the theme is the central roles of inequality and hierarchy in the way we think about the environment, and the people in that environment, and then the animals down the road, down that great chain of being, and then the plants, and then the minerals, and then the earth, right? So this discussion makes it clear that social ecological inequality is not only a material thing, but an ideological thing. It has very deep ideological roots. They're so deeply embedded that we're not usually even conscious of them. And material factors structure our lives, that's for sure, in equal ways, leading to hierarchical visions of the world, just as ideological factors allow the material structures of inequality to develop and persist. And I think that the reason that there was so much emphasis on gender in this chapter as part of our ideologies is that it probably wouldn't matter if all gender relations were equal, if all ideological concepts of different genders, from the standard binary of women, how women are thought of in relation to men, to the LGBTQ variations of that. If there was no oppression and inequality in relation to that, everybody was just equally, accepted, then it wouldn't be an issue, and it wouldn't be a reflection of how we relate to the environment. But it's not. There's that kind of inequality, and the associations we have with women as, more natural, or in the case of LGBTQ people with, bestiality, or, animalness, or that kind of thing. That all comes from also our ideas about the environment. So that's it for this week.